Thank you all for coming today, and Aaron Gobra for St. Patrick's Day. See, most of us are in our green, ready to go. And thank you for sharing your beautiful Sunday afternoon with me to talk about this very fascinating piece, yet forgotten piece of our local history, and really American history, aviation history. Now, we're going to talk about, in a few moments, Roma, but let's learn a little bit about the differences between all these different airships so we can learn about the different vernacular I'll be using throughout today. Now, the different types of lighter than air, or LTA, which stands for basically airships. We're going to talk about what's the middle one, which is the semi-rigid type. But non-rigid is what we usually think of as like the blimps, which are the very small ones, which could carry just a couple of people. The rigid is what you would think of when you think of, say, Hindenburg or the Graf Zeppelin, which are this massive, over 1,000 feet long airships, and they have a structure inside the gas bags. And then, of course, we have our balloons, which, of course, we had one here. We were just talking about during the Civil War, which was the birth of American military aviation. Today, we're going to be concerning ourselves with the love child, so to say, of the non-rigid and rigid airships. The semi-rigid that usually was just a marriage of these two technologies, the non-rigid and the rigid. Now with Roma, she was a little bit of an interesting one. We're going to go back to the previous slide for a second, where you see that kind of that triangular piece on the bottom. That was a rigid keel, so it had these kind of articulated poles that held it together, but the top had 11 mini balloons in it. After the presentation, I have the blueprints of it up here if you want to take a look. And now we're going to talk about what creates lift. Unlike a fixed wing, which is basically your airplanes, lift, it requires some sort of gas that is, well, lighter than air to lift these airships up. At the time we're speaking of, which is the early 20th century, they relied on hydrogen. Hydrogen, it was a type of gas they could produce very easily. It was inexpensive at about only $3 per cubic foot. The downside about it was, well, flammable. Now, we all think, well, why didn't they use helium? Well, they only had a limited supply of it because it was a natural resource they had to procure. And it was also 6 times more expensive than hydrogen, with a lift value of about 9.2% less than hydrogen. Now, okay, that seems like, okay, well, we can make that work, but when you think of the airplanes at the time, it was a very new invention, and the pilots during World War II, there was a study done much later on that they only had a lifespan of about 2 weeks. So flying with a big, giant hydrogen bomb above your head was a little bit more palatable than flying in a plane that could possibly crash and kill you within 2 weeks. And there we go. During World War II, or World War I, excuse me, we really started understanding the value of aircraft technology, and especially the lighter than air. The Germans came up with this amazing invention in the Zeppelin, which is what we think of as the rigid airships. During the German Blitz over England, they killed 700 people, seriously injured 2,000 by dropping bombs, coming in the dead of night, these gigantic machines dropping bombs, and they seemed almost impenetrable. Now, at the end of World War I, when we decided to take all the resources away from the Rhineland, one of the big things we wanted to take away were their airships and their airship technology. And what it did is it really changed our warfare. In the United States, we were starting to process people out of the Army after the war. However, we were trying to get them into the aviation programs. I personally love this because it really speaks to, I love the language of it, it's so floral. Trying to pull people into this community in the military. They wanted to bring people in. They were transferring them from other types of jobs within the military. And they were sending them to places like Langley Field, which was fairly newly established by this point. In a moment, we're going to meet a gentleman by the name of Captain Dale Mabry. If you've ever been to Tampa, you've probably heard of Dale Mabry Highway. And there was Dale Mabry Field. Well, this is the gentleman we're about to see here in a few minutes who was the commanding officer of this particular airship. And it shows him basically directing this flight. Now, Dale Mabry was a very handsome man. He was a ladies' man, known about town for going and chasing after girls, or more so the girls chasing him. But he was also a very promising aviator. He came from a family where his father was a judge, his brother was a doctor or a dentist, and he was a real estate agent before joining during World War I. He found his promise in the lighter-than-air community. He was an evangelist for the technology. He told everyone this was going to change the way we did war. And there were many that agreed with him, including Billy Mitchell, who was thought of as the father of, well, the modern U.S. Air Force. He was one of the many, Captain Mabry, who thought that these were even going to replace the newly founded aircraft carriers someday. But in this particular ship, it was a very small airship that could only have a small crew complement. After the war, the Navy was given the charge of these large, rigid airships. But the Army wanted one for themselves. And there came Roma. Roma was built in 1919. She was originally designed for World War I, but when the war ended, before they could put her into use, they refitted her to be a kind of a transportation vessel, sightseeing vessel for Italy. She was given the designation T-34, which stood for Transatlantic 34,000 cubic feet of hydrogen within her gas bag. She was 410 feet long, 92 feet tall, and she, again, had a gas volume of 34,000 cubic meters, which was about 1.193 cubic feet. She had a power plant of 6 engines that ran parallel to each other along the keel, and which were 450 horsepower engines. And you can see these numbers, the 1 through 11, those were the mini balloons inside the larger airship. Now, the Italians wanted to sell her for reasons that we can only guess, and we'll get into in just a second. And when the Navy passed on Roma, Billy Mitchell held his hand up and said, "We need this for the Army. We can use her for training. We can use her for other purposes like spying." And so they decided they were going to put together a team of their best and brightest men to go over to Italy to acquire this airship. In 1921, they picked Major John G. Thornell to be the commanding officer. He finished near the bottom of his class at West Point, and he was originally in the infantry. But during the war, he went and trained in France as a lighter-than-air officer, and he turned out to be one of the most promising lighter-than-air officers they had, to the point where he was pulled off duty as a commanding officer of a lighter-than-air field to be the commander of this big, bright airship that was going to be a status symbol for the Army. And of course, he had a rather unfortunate mustache, too, so. And then we're going to meet Lieutenant Walter J. Reid. He was also a lighter-than-air aviator during World War I, but he got out after the war until his best friend, Captain Dale Mabry, calls him and says, "We want you to come back in. We have this brand new ship. We want you to be third in command." So he calls up his girlfriend, Maria Reid, who you see there with him, and says, "They want to send me over to Italy to check out this new airship. What do you think about getting married? Maybe we can do our honeymoon over there." She agreed. And on February 4th, 1921, they got married in New York City with Dale Mabry, who's standing in the back, serving as Reid's best man. And over to Italy they sailed. We're going to meet Master Sergeant Harry A. Chapman, who was one of the best and brightest engineers and crewmen they had to offer. He was a loyal man. He joined during 1916, and he served during the war. He was, again, one of the best and brightest engineers they had. And Sgt Virgil Hoffman. Sergeant Hoffman was from Eaton Rapids, Michigan. He was from a railroading family. While he was stationed at Langley Field during the war, he met this young lady, Stella Hoover, from Phoebus. They fell in love, and he got out after the war, and they would spend days just writing letters to each other, reading each other's letters, and just in love. And when the Army called him and said, "We'd like you to come back, please come into the lighter-than-air division again," he said, "I'll come back under one condition. You let me go back to Langley." And they agreed, and they placed him as part of the crew for Roma. This picture was taken about the time they had gotten engaged, and they were due to get married in June 1922. Immediately following the Reid's wedding, they sailed over to Italy to procure the ship. It was kind of an interesting sailing voyage over there. They were met with rough seas, and they were in a ship full of graveyard attendants. At one point, Walter J. Reid turns to his new wife and says to her, if anything happens to the ship, climb in the coffins and sail away. Of course, she panics, but luckily they got over there quite safely. Once they arrived in Italy, as per the contract, they were told they can only have one trial flight at the Italians' designation as to when. No one questioned this. They're like, okay, we'll go with it. March 15th, 1921 was a sunny, warm Italian day. They were met there by dignitaries such as Ambassador Robert Underwood Johnson, Prince Viggo of Denmark and his entire entourage, the designers of the ship, including Umberto Nobile, who you see in this picture with the kind of the bowler cap, standing with Ambassador Robert Underwood Johnson. There's several prominent Italian people that were there, and then the wives of both Walter Reid and Major John G. Thornell. Now, the inspection flight, I'd like to say, was more of a spectacle than it was an inspection. Now, keep in mind, this was during Prohibition, and wine was flowing freely throughout this entire flight. They were known to chuck bottles off the side. There were elaborate three-course meals. The wheel was often left unattended. There were people throwing up over the side, so you will. And it was described by the smiling gentleman, Kenneth Roberts, that you see in this picture, as having a prisoner of Zenda feel. Now, during this three-course meal, one of the American crew, who I assume was probably Captain Mabry, because it sounds like something he would say, talking about how he missed his evening cigar, to which one of the designers said, you don't want to light a cigar on this ship. You know, there's hydrogen up there. And he's like, oh, you could light a bonfire in the middle of this ship and nothing will happen. In fact, they were so distracted, they didn't even notice when the ship couldn't gain enough lift to go over the caldera of Mount Vesuvius, but went over to the side. After they decided to stumble off the ship that evening in a drunken stupor, Major Thornell wrote to his superiors and wrote, I am most impressed with this semi-rigid type of airship and believe it has great possibilities. Now, the Italians originally asked for a sale price of $475,000, but they readily negotiated down to $184,000. No one questioned this whatsoever. This is actually a piece of the original contract. Now, Thornell said this ship was supposed to fly transatlantically. It had never done that by this point. Can we do it? And the War Department's like, no, just box her up, send her back. The ship was a few years old, and the bag itself was made out of a silk cotton blend that could only be produced in Italy and needed a 6-month lead time. So he said, okay, can we buy a new bag? And they're like, no, patch it up, it'll be fine. Send it back, send it over to Langley Field. And so they did. During the summer of 1921, we really start seeing publicly the dangers of hydrogen in these airships. ZR-2, or R-38, was a rigid airship built by the British for the United States Navy. It was not flying under American colors yet when several members of the United States Navy flew over to do a trial flight with the British. In August 1921, they were flying over the Humber River when the ship broke in half, exploded, and killed all but 5 of the 49 men on board. Lieutenant Clifford Tinker, who was a public affairs officer for the United States Navy, had to accompany several of his shipmates home, and he swore to himself that no one else would die because of hydrogen on an airship. It was going to be his mission. He soon got out of the Navy, and he started pounding the pavement, knocking on doors to whatever government official would listen to him to try to get helium instead of hydrogen put in these airships. Now, Roma was going to be home ported out of Langley Field. This is a picture that comes from much later, but it was founded in 1916 as a joint effort for aviation experimentation and training between the Army, Navy across the river, and NACO, which was the predecessor to NASA. That big kind of hangar you see down there was Roma's hangar that was built purposely for her. Now, Langley was an ideal place because they had a hydrogen processing plant there, the balloon school was there, and even the photography school was right there. And when the original airship hangar burned down, they wanted to build a brand new one for Roma. Now, this new one was 116 feet tall, 420 feet long, and 125 feet wide. It could fit Roma and one small blimp inside of it. When Roma arrived that August, around the same time that ZR-2 exploded, they unpacked the boxes and found holes and mildew covering the bag. And of course, we all know what August is like around here. It's not exactly the most forgiving weather or humidity. In fact, Master Sergeant Harry Chapman described her as resembling lukewarm beeswax as he pulled her apart. Again, Major Thornell said, "We need a new bag." And they said, "No, patch her up. You'll be fine. Let's save the money." In the meantime, we get some new members of the crew. We have Lieutenant Byron Hebert, Jr., who you see standing here with Captain Mabry. He was a gifted LTA guy. In fact, he just came from teaching. And I'm not sure if he was exactly a lucky guy to have on board, considering he survived 4 other airship crashes. And then we have little Alberto Duke Flores, who is the gentleman on the far end there, and you can see his name scrawled below that. Corporal Flores came from Puerto Rico to serve during World War I, and he, again, was a trusted man. It was his job to be at the very top of Roma, in the crow's nest, to monitor the tautness of the bag. He had an extraordinarily important job, but scary, because he had to stick his head out mid-air on top of this bag. Now, the reconstruction for Roma was difficult because of all these holes and patches they were constantly needing to put on. They couldn't get hydrogen purity, which at that time, I believe our requirement was 92% hydrogen purity. You mix the wrong levels of hydrogen and oxygen, and you get a big kaboom. Now, they kept patching and patching and patching. And then the inflation tests were difficult because they couldn't even get her to stay inflated. Again, request was denied for a new gas bag. And then finally, they were able to maintain hydrogen purity enough and keep her inflated enough to schedule a trial flight, the first flight in America, for November 1921. On November 15th, 1921, about 1,000 people gathered at Langley Field. Obviously, security was a bit different then than it is now, to watch this magnificent Grand Eagle, as they called her in the newspaper, fly for the first time. Everyone was nervous. Would she fly? Would she be okay? What would happen? The goal was to lift evenly. That meant every single one of the bags was perfect in its level of hydrogen and oxygen ratio. Now, this back piece here you see is the rudder. It had movable vertical and horizontal surfaces. It was a unique piece of this ship that many of the guys distrusted because they had never seen it before. They held their breath as Roma lifted from the ground, perfectly even. And you can kind of see a hatch at the top where Duke Flores was sticking his head out. They held their breath, and then from the ship, Major Thornell radios down to Langley, says, "How did we look?" To which they said, "Magnificent!" And then a loud roar lifted from the inside the ship. They even found a stowaway on board, and they were so happy they lifted out up okay, they just put him to work on the ship. Now, this flight wasn't without fault or failure. Major Jethro Bell was on one of the engines. And they had these engines, the Ansaldo engines, which were made for southern Italian climates. They tended to run oily. And in November, here, you didn't exactly want an oily engine, and it kept freezing up. They also had another issue at about 11 a.m. when an aluminum door broke off the keel, slammed into one of the rudders, and splintered the bag. Now, Sergeant Lee Harris knew he had mere moments to save the ship and his shipmates. He climbed into this bag, grabbed 2 other guys, and they patched it, and they patched it, and they patched it until they passed out from breathing the hydrogen. They saved the ship, and they were fine in the end. Now, this flight was hailed a success. In the meantime, Clifford Tinker was again knocking on the doors, begging people to listen. We need to do helium tests. We need the data so I can prove to you that this is a good gas to use. It's worth the investment. So kind of, I guess, to shut him up, the Navy agreed to do tests on their C-7 airship, which you see here, and as you can see, it's much smaller than Roma. So they flew 3 trial flights between Naval Station Norfolk, or the air station down there, in Washington, D.C. There was a lot of good data they got from this. They noticed that it didn't expand or contract like hydrogen did. They didn't have any gas loss whatsoever. And it proved it would be a long-term fiscal advantage because they could just use the same helium over and over again. In fact, Aerial Age Weekly, which was a popular journal at the time, said, summed up, it can be said the use of helium as a gas for inhalation of airships has been demonstrated beyond a doubt. Even with all this data, even with Clifford Tinker screaming, the War Department quietly closed the helium storage facility and procurement plant in Fort Worth, Texas. Clifford Tinker went to the War Department and said, I have a figure here, $14,000. That's what it would cost us to move the helium from Fort Worth to Langley for Roma. The War Department told him, we don't have the money. We can't do that. Hydrogen will be fine. We'll be okay. December 21st, 1921 was the christening of Roma up at Langley Field in Washington, D.C. They left a little late. They were struggling in the air with the engines. Again, she had 6 engines. Mid-air, several of them froze up. They managed to get one of the ones unfrozen, and they arrived at Bowling limping on 3 of 6 engines. And as you can see, as she's coming in, she's kind of shimmying down because they're struggling to just maneuver her. Now, an interesting thing, which you might not be able to see on this video, as they were coming down, the halyard on the flag broke, and it was hanging upside down. Rather ironic, considering that's a sign of distress. It was a cold day, and they had to cut their ceremony short once they were able to pull her to the ground. But pulling her to the ground was no easy feat, given she was a very heavy ship, and she was not exactly cooperating. They threw the lines down. The men are pulling and pulling to try to get her to the ground. There she is. You can see them kind of chasing after. Her ship's sponsor was supposed to originally fly on this free hot air balloon and break a bottle of liquid oxygen over the bow. Turns out they just put a little ladder up so she can climb up and break it. And you can see the men inside. That is the control cabin, which was midship. During the ceremony, the ship rolled onto its side, tore the bag, and they had to patch her up. They left with a skeleton crew that evening and limped into Langley that night on 1 working engine. Attention turned from this trouble with the bag to troubles with the engines. They needed something that would work better in our climate. So they decided they were going to refit the Liberty V12 engines. But before they could do that, they had to take care of some personnel business. Major Thornell was up for orders, and he was given orders to Washington, D.C. And he said, I will take those orders if you let me fly on Roma just as a passenger one more time. They readily agreed, and they promoted Captain Dale Mabry as the commanding officer of Roma. Lieutenant Walter J. Reid was given a promotion to captain, and he became second in command. In the meantime, many of the crewmen were very hesitant of the ship, and that's an understatement. In fact, Master Sergeant Jethro Bell created something called the Graveyards Club. And he wrote to one of his friends that someday it's going to wrap itself around a tree and then all will be over. Jethro was trying everything he could to get transferred off of the ship. He didn't want to die. But of course, they weren't going to let go of the best and brightest they had. They needed them to stay with this ship. Now, out in McCook Field in Dayton, Ohio, they were refitting what was once, this is one of the original Saldo engines, which is on display up at the Air Force Museum. And they were refitting to the Liberty V12 engines. They had to change out the exhaust, they had to change out the props so they would be able to be used on an airship. They put Charles Dvorak as the leading man in charge of these engines. And he and a crew of civilians were sent to Langley Field to fit and train Roma on these new engines. They had a trial flight scheduled for February 21st, 1922. The night before, they had a dance of the Officers Club at Langley. Everyone was celebrating their flight the next day and the camaraderie. Many of the students at the air school were begging to be on board the next day for their flight pay. And Captain Reid was sick, and he was home that night. And his wife was begging him, "Stay home, you're sick." And of course, as all of us military wives know, if the ship is going out or up, so is he. The next day was a cold and dreary morning. Don't all good stories start that way? When everyone arrived at the hangar, including Captain Reid to his wife's protests, they weren't even sure if they were going to fly that morning. They got her ready, and then Captain Mabry dismissed them for lunch. And during lunch, Corporal Irby Hevron turns to his friend Corporal Nathan Currow, who was a non-flying member of the crew, and says, kind of tongue-in-cheek, "If anything happens to me, you're taking me home." And of course, my Bixby just yelled at me on my phone. Anyway, it was a last-minute decision that Captain Mabry said, "All right, we're going to take her up this day. We'll be fine." In fact, it was so last minute that the ship's mascot dog was left behind in the hangar. Now, during liftoff, it was a little bit leery. Now, we saw how she looked on the November where she was going up very even. But on this day, she was going up nose heavy, meaning there's too much oxygen in this front bag. On the ground, one of the civilian ground crew saw is this triangular patch fluttering down towards him. And he kind of made a mental note of this. On board that day was Walter McNair from the Bureau of Standards, and it was his job to test the speed of the ship. The ship had never gone up beyond 54 miles per hour, but he noticed that she was clocking 75 miles per hour. Now, upon getting to their desired altitude, she was able to gain horizontal equilibrium. They flew over downtown Hampton, where Captain Reid dropped a messenger bottle down on his in-law's yard to let his wife know that he was okay. You know, it's okay. He's sick, but he's okay. They flew over Phoebus, where Sgt Virgil Hoffman leaned out the window and screamed down to his fiancée, "I love you, Stella." And once they reach about Old Point Comfort, Captain Reid starts to feel really sick and turns to Lieutenant Burt and says, "Hey, I need you to take over controls. I'm going to go back to the passenger cabin and relax." In the meantime, Corporal Flores, who is up at the tip of the nose, crawls out to measure the tautness and notice it's millimeters off. Now, this is a big deal in a ship that requires structural integrity in order to maintain. In the meantime, Burt is pulling the controls, which are ropes and wheels, and they're moving freely in his hands, and the ship's not responding. Dook tries to crawl in through the tunnels from the top of the ship down to warn the crew below, who's already starting to understand something is wrong as they're crossing the river. Burt turns to Captain Mabry and says, "The ship's not responding. We need to do something." In the meantime, Corporal Flores can't get through this pinched passage, and he's caught at the top of the ship without any way to inform everyone below. Once they reach Norfolk people on the ground are seeing the ship barreling towards the ground. One little boy is in the backyard with his mother and points to the ship, and his mother cups her hand over her mouth and says, "Those poor men." There were Navy lighter-than-air aviators who were watching from the ground and saw something was wrong. In the meantime, they were trying to save the ship. They were throwing everything they could over the sides. They were throwing over chairs. They were throwing over tools, anything they could to lighten the load to try to save the ship. But nothing was working. And they were coming towards the ground at the Army Quartermaster Depot, which is today Norfolk International Terminals. Men are in the passenger cabin, clutching each other, screaming, crying, praying, frantic. Meanwhile, at the Quartermaster Depot, they're trying to turn off the electricity. They can't let a giant hydrogen airship come into contact with electricity. Lieutenant Reilly, a student observer on the ship, becomes manic. He has his parachute on his back. And as they're coming closer to the ground, he jumps. On top of that crow's nest, Corporal Flores is clutching, knowing he has mere moments to save himself. It was obvious to them there was no longer going to be saving the ship. They needed to save each other. The last thing anyone hears right before the nose touches the ground is Captain Mabry screaming, "My God, boys." As that nose touches the ground, Corporal Flores leaps from the ship, and he runs, not even sure if he's in the air or on the ground, until someone catches him. And then, boom, the ship explodes behind him. Brilliant flames leap into the sky, and witnesses describe seeing vestiges of men writhing in the flames, screaming, "Mercy, oh mercy," before they're swallowed. Master Sergeant Chapman, who was thrown from the ship, dives back in, cuts the fabric, and tries to pull whoever he can out. Lieutenant Byron Burt, who was also thrown from the ship, is trying to get back to help until someone catches him, telling him, "You can't go near that." Charles Dvorak stumbles away from the ship, covered in mud. All you can see are his eyes staring as the mud in his skin peel away from his body. Nearby on the ground, they found the first person they knew died. Crushed from the impact was Lieutenant Reilly. The ship was just simply not high enough for his parachute to save him. Anyone who they were able to get out, they took to a nearby hospital. They didn't know how many people survived at this point or how many died. But suffice it to say, if you didn't get out of that ship, either with Chapman or before that explosion, you didn't. Maria Reid has someone knock on her door and tell her, "Roma's down, but we don't know where your husband is." Being the forthright woman she was able to get one of her husband's friends to fly her over to Norfolk. And it was her job to find her husband and make sure he was okay. The survivors were taken to the public health hospital, and it's there that Maria found her husband. There were 11 men crammed into this ward out of the 45 that went up that morning. When a clandestine reporter wandered in, they asked him, "What of the other boys?" And he had the unfortunate responsibility of telling them that they were the only 11 to survive out of 45. One of the men screamed, "Terrible." These were their brothers. Charles Dvorak and Master Sergeant Chapman were clinging to life. Master Sergeant Chapman was unscathed when he was thrown, but because of his heroic efforts to save his shipmates, he was quickly losing his own life. They were later transferred to Fort Monroe as they were able to, and this is Duke Flores and Sergeant Joseph Biedenbach. They were put under orders not to speak to anyone because an investigation had to happen. They had to figure out why, what happened that day. Back on the scene on February 21st, 1922, to me this is the most haunting of any image of Roma. Lieutenant Burt returns to the scene, stares into the wreckage. It's the man who survived all those other airship crashes, World War I. It was that single moment that he never forgot. He knew it was his mission to find out why his shipmates died, why these men who he served with, who he lived with, who he knew and he loved like his own siblings, why were they gone? Rescue attempts soon turned into recovery. The remains were pulled from the wreckage. They used anything they could to attach the bodies to help identify them. Silver ID bracelet, cigarette case, coins in the pocket of a non-burned uniform. The last man that was pulled from the wreckage, which you see here covered in the sheet in the middle, was clutching a control wheel. They were put into hearses and transported across the river to Newport News to Ralph's funeral home for the identification process. Upon arrival, Dr. Jesse Mabry, Captain Mabry's older brother, was there to help. Also, Captain William Kemper, a non-flying member of the crew, was there, and several other men. These several other men couldn't handle the sight they saw that night. Captain Kemper later wrote to one of my own colleagues in the 1970s that he never forgot that night, what he saw. These were his brothers, his boon companions, he wrote. And having to identify them was traumatizing. Dr. Jesse Mabry helped wherever he could until they got to the last body, the man holding the control wheel, his own little brother, Captain Dale Mabry. A hero to the end, he never left his post. Families started coming in to collect the remains of their loved ones. Captain William Kempner had the unfortunate responsibility to be there to guide them through it. One father asked to see what was inside the casket. He needed to know this was his son. He turned to Captain Kemper and said, "He has a scar on his pelvis. Did you see the scar?" Captain Kempner, trying to be sensitive, said, "Sir, I assure you this is your son." He said, "Please tell me you saw the scar." Captain Kempner had the duty to tell him that his son's pelvis was missing. Now, they soon discovered that hydrogen was the catalyst behind the explosion. That rudder grazed a telephone wire and ignited the unstable hydrogen inside the bag. Lieutenant Clarence Welch, during the investigation, said, "I am sure the ship would not have burned so quickly, but what a great number of men could have been saved in an attempt made to save the others, had a non-burning gas been used inside." In fact, this picture in particular, Master Sergeant Roger McNally is standing in front of our statue, our victory monument here in Yorktown with his family. The investigation was again underway and it was classified. And you see this gentleman, Sergeant Joseph Bryan. He's holding a dress cover in his hands, and I have that outside for you all to see. Now, the role of hydrogen was downplayed in the newspapers, yet in Congress they were debating. Should we end the lighter than air programs altogether? Should we keep using hydrogen? What do we do? But all that debate had to be put on hold until some sort of public memorial service could be held. The city of Newport News stepped in with the Huntington Rifles Reserve Unit on February 24th, 1922. The bodies of Captain Mabry and Private John E. Thompson, the only one not claimed, were used to represent the crew. Thousands lined the streets, crying, hugging each other as if this were their own brother or father or loved one. They played Saul's Death March as they marched to the casino grounds in Newport News. Even the mascot dog, which you see here next to Captain Mabry's casket, was on hand to say his final farewells. There were promises made at the ceremony for grand memorials and that these men would never be forgotten about. And near the end of the service, friends of the men of Roma flew their planes over top, dropping roses down. But this display didn't quite capture the pain felt by those left behind. Stella Hoover was unable to bring herself to attend her fiance's funeral in Eden Rapids, Michigan. This is a picture from Sgt Virgil Hoffman's funeral. She went up to Eden Rapids that June, around the time they were supposed to get married. And she wrote to her mother that going to her beloved's grave had ripped a hole in her heart that would never heal. So what happened to Roma? Souvenir poachers were on the ground, ready to take any souvenir they could. In fact, my husband's great-grandfather was a boy at that time, rode his bike to the grounds and tried to steal one of those control wheels, and they told him, put it back. It's part of the investigation. This is one of the few remaining pieces of Roma that still exists, and it's in a scrapbook at the Sargent Memorial Collection in Norfolk. Any piece of her they could get was taken back to Langley Field, and Lieutenant Burt led the charge to investigate, to try to reassemble her as best as possible to figure out what happened. She was moving so fast that one of the cables snapped. That rudder snapped, moved at a 45-degree angle, and they lost control. And she essentially folded in on herself as she careened towards the ground. What was left of her was scrapped, and she was forgotten about, buried with the 34 men that died. Now, the legacy Roma did leave was that the all-American airships were no longer going to be filled with hydrogen. The hydrogen processing plant, as it stands today, still at Langley, was abandoned after many years of trying to repurpose it. Do not ask me how I came across this next picture, but this is the interior of it. Now, June 1922, which was the end of the fiscal year, the War Department returned a budget surplus of $6.5 million of balance. Of that, $1.3 million were supposed to be used to transport supplies for the U.S. Army Air Service. As Clifford Tinker came up with a figure, $14,000 of that $1.3 million that they had could have been used to transport helium from Fort Worth to Langley for that flight. It was a cost of approximately $412 per life lost that day. Money we had, a danger we knew, but we neglected. As we were increasing our technology with the heavier than air of the planes, we continued to have accidents with airships. Now, the Army was not allowed to have any more big airships, but the Navy did. The USS Shannon Doha, who Captain Reid was actually part of the construction crew for, crashed on September 3rd, 1925. That's an interesting story. Killed 14 of the men on board, and 29 survived. The USS Akron, the deadliest of all these airships, crashed April 4th, 1933. 73 deaths and only 3 survivors. The final one, her sister ship, the USS Makin, crashed February 12th, 1935, with only 2 deaths and 74 survivors. But this was just too much. And we essentially discontinued at least our large airship programs and eventually our airship programs altogether. Now on May 6, 1937, We have the image of Hindenburg coming towards the ground, Lakehurst, New Jersey, and Herb Morrison screaming, "Oh, the humanity!" and 36 of the passengers dying, with 62 survivors. But it was this moment that truly defined airships for all of history. In fact, Vice Admiral Charles Rosendahl, who was second command of Shannon Doha, commanding officer of Los Angeles, and he was commanding officer of Lakehurst at the time of Hindenburg, said, "We let the Hindenburg disaster become the turning point. It won't be many years before you have the return of the airships." It's an interesting note because he was right. And today we have a few civilian groups that are dabbling in lighter-than-air aviation, including an interesting one out in England built by Lockheed. But our use of airships for the military is pretty much done. So what happened to those 11 survivors? Charles Dvorak, after almost close to a year in the hospital, returned to Dayton, Ohio, having not just the physical scars of his injuries, but the mental and emotional. He was described as having these incredible nervous spells, and what we would probably classify today as PTSD. It took him 12 years to petition Congress to receive any sort of financial compensation for what he lost that day. He was never able to return to his work. He's seen here next to the gentleman with the bow tie, and that's Ray Hurley. Those two are the two survivors in that group of Roma. Now, for Captain Walter J. Reid, who would be on your far left up there, he went on to obtain the rank of Brigadier General. I had the honor of speaking to his son several years ago and described him as this loving, gentle, patient, kind man. He served during World War II and earned his wings in the heavier-than-air division. He had this diary he would keep, and he was on a military transport coming into the river with his wife to visit his in-laws. And he wrote in his diary, looking at the sky, that he never forgot. He died in 1963. Master Sergeant Harry Alphaeus Chapman, the man who dove back in those flames to save his shipmates, was transferred to Walter Reed Hospital in Washington, D.C., fighting for his life. After a year, he was considered a survivor, and he married his nurse. He went back to active duty, but he suffered from long-term injuries on his lungs, never a smoker, and he died of lung cancer in 1940, Roma's last victim. He was the only crewman or officer or anyone from that day to receive any sort of commendation, as he rightfully deserved, being the first recipient of the now-defunct Cheney Award. After he passed away, some of his friends from Langley Field took his ashes and they spread them over his favorite mountain in Hawaii. For Corporal Alberto Duke Flores, who is the old man you see in the middle here, he would always talk about his exploits on the airships, but he never again flew in one after Roma. Master Sergeant Alberto Duke Flores was the last survivor of Roma, and I have his burial flag out there, when he died in 1988. Now, there was no grand memorial ever put up for Roma as promised. No stone, no honors, no accolades. When the Army Quartermaster Depot was shut down and the terminals were opened, the men there, remembering the disaster, pulled their money together and were able to erect this stone. And this is as it stood in 2014. It's on the grounds of the Crumbly House, which is behind a locked gate, completely inaccessible to the public. When I went to see it on this particular day, I actually had to have an armed escort from the Virginia Port Authority, because I'm so threatening. So it was at that point I have been very fortunate to become friends and acquaintances with several of the family members that are still living today. We pulled our resources together and we went to the Virginia Department of Historic Resources 2 years ago. And we were approved for a historic highway marker for Norfolk. I'd like to say it's up. We were supposed to put it up last November, but the city of Norfolk has lost it. So hopefully it'll go up soon. But soon enough, there will be some sort of public acknowledgement for their sacrifice. As a final thought, I have lived with Roma for close to a decade. It's been an incredible honor to be their voice. And that's what we do as historians. We are the voices for those who no longer have theirs. And it's our job to tell the stories for posterity so they never, ever die. But these men, their voices were quieted for almost a century. And it troubled me so deeply. And it has been an incredible, like I said, honor to give them back their voices and to represent their families and share their stories with you. So there is that life back and their sacrifice. And thank you very much. And this is my cheap plug right here.
Nancy, thank you very much for an outstanding presentation. We greatly appreciate it. We'll now turn it over for question and answers. The one thing I ask that you do is if you have a question, just raise your hand and let me get the microphone to you. Even though everybody in the room can probably hear you, we need the audio for the video presentation. So I think I saw a question over here.
I actually have two questions.
Okay. I have two
The first is, my first question is, did they ever figure out why it was going at 76 miles per hour, why it was going so fast?
That's an excellent question. The reason why it was going so fast is these new engines that were put onto it were not only more powerful, they were also significantly lighter. So you multiply that by 6 new engines, it just didn't have as much heft, and they didn't balance the physics very well with the way the ship was. So it just maneuvered the ship a lot faster than it was capable of going.
And you said you've lived with them for 10 years. How did you get interested in the first place?
That's a very, very good question. I was kind of writing these little online articles about local history. I grew up on the south side of Hampton Roads. I'm also the daughter of a retired service member. My husband's active duty military. And it always bothers me when you have these stories about people who aren't honored. And to learn about this airship, which I have fascination with aviation history, I turned to my husband, who grew up right across the street pretty much from where the crash occurred, said, "Have you heard of this?" And he was like, "No." And then my parents have lived here for a very long time. I asked them, and they hadn't heard of it either. And it was just such an incredible story. How hadn't anyone else told it yet? And then pulling back the layers of the proverbial onion, all roads in my life lead to Roma, as I like to say. I found out Marion Jethro Bell was actually a cousin of mine, so, which is rather a kismet, if you will. But it definitely became a driving force to get them the honor they deserve.
Another question? Here you go.
I wanted to ask if Walter J. Reid was related to Walter Reid of the hospital, who was born over in Gloucester.
That's excellent, but no, he was not. Okay. He was from a little town in New York, Scarsborough, I think it was called, and he was a graduate of Columbia University, and he was an architect before going into the war. So it's interesting. I can't help but wonder if his parents named him after.
I got one other question.
Yeah.
Since you were into lighter than air, have you been into Tillamook, Oregon, where they have the hangars there that the Navy used during World War II?
I have not had that.
Well, you need to go see
yet.
that, because one of them, well, they're taller than this room, maybe 3 times higher, but up at the top they have a basket for basketball, and they said that was for Wilt to Stilt Chamberlain.
I was going to say, you got to wonder if anyone made a basket with that one. Yeah, these hangars are massive, and the one that was at Langley was torn down in the 40s, I want to say. But if you go over to Langley, that part of the base is still called the LTA section. Several of the streets are named for the victims of Roma. And if you go out into the field, you can still find some of the cement from the floor of that hangar. So there's still vestiges of it that remains, but these hangars were just unbelievably massive, like you were saying. It's incredible.
I kind of have two questions too. One of those, I'm trying to figure out the amount of time between the Roma and the Hindenburg,
It
and
was
why there was still hydrogen then.
It was about 15 years, and Hindenburg was a German ship. We don't like to publicize the photos of the big swastika on the back on her fins. The Germans, honestly, they had a better grasp of the dangers of hydrogen, so they required about a 98% purity. And so they tended to take care of their airships a little bit better than we did and didn't have quite the number of accidents we did. But Hindenburg was what ended it for them altogether. And it was that public display that really put the nail in the coffin, proverbially speaking. We historians have a bit of Graves humor, don't we, for airships altogether.
They just kept going for a long time, it seemed.
It did. And we still have some unmanned airships we use for the Army. We use them as for drone purposes. There was one that actually got away from Aberdeen Proving Grounds, what was that, about 2014, I want to say? And it crashed into, and there's this lovely picture of it crashing into an Amish field up in Lancaster County. But yeah, it really was a technology that became very obsolete very quickly.
My other question is, where did you get those amazing videos?
A lot of internet scouring. And I'm very fortunate I have a husband who is in the media department for the United States Navy, so he knows how to really get those off the internet for me. Thank you.
Yeah, a couple of things. First, welcome to the Historical Committee. Obviously, we're going to pick your
Thank
brain
you.
a lot.
It is an absolute honor to be on this committee. It's incredible. Thank you.
A couple of things. Between the Roma and then, of course, the Shannon Doha and Akron, one, did they ever go to the helium on those ships? Okay, and I had heard stories that one reason they were still using hydrogen in the Hindenburg is that, of course, the Nazi government in Germany then, and when he went to Roosevelt and said, hey, we want to buy your helium, because we basically, the story I heard was the United States had cornered the market on helium and said, ain't going to happen. So negotiations broke down, and he went straight on out and used hydrogen, which we know how that ended up. And also, did any of your research, did you get any stories on the lighter than air, what's left of the hangar out there at Langley? Can you tell us anything about that?
Really, all it's left is maybe less than half of a foot of the cement, and it's really hard to find. The processing plant itself, I have been contacting a lot of different people trying to figure out what they're going to do with it. From what I can tell, not that I know anything about its very current condition as of this February on the interior, not that I know anything about that. It's not in the best shape at all. The bones are good, but not that great. So I have a feeling they're going to end up tearing that down. It's basically becoming a lost story.
Another question?
I'll be out there afterwards.
Got a question back here?
It's my daughter.
So, if they used helium in the Acro, why was it the deadliest of them? Because wouldn't have hydrogen made it even deadlier?
One word, sharks.
But
The Shannon Doha was based on, to go back a ship or two, the Shannon Doha was based on plans of a German rigid airship. That was a height climber, but because we were using helium, we had to expand the length of this airship to compensate for this difference between the helium and hydrogen. As it was flying over Ohio during storm season, it broke into three pieces. Now, the commanding officer, Zachary Lansdowne, who was a hero, sent everyone over to the other parts of the ship, and they were able to free balloon the ship down. They knew what they were doing. Zachary Lansdowne lost his life, which is why we didn't have more people die in that one. Now, we had Los Angeles, which was only used for basically show purposes. And there's Frank Green posted a picture several years ago of the Los Angeles flying over top of Yorktown. That's pretty cool. But then the Akron basically broke up over water, and a lot of the men ended up in the water and sharks. And so because we didn't have quite the shark situation with the Makin, that's why that wasn't as deadly, but yeah.
Got time for about one more. Anybody else?
I think we had a continuing question, right?
I'm sorry. Yeah.
Yeah, just to follow up on the huge concrete structure at Langley.
Yes.
Is the docking port or part of the hangar, what was that for? Is that that's part of the airship area?
Yeah, that's part of the airship area, but it's for NASA. They use it now for their testing, their test planes. It's a little bit over from where the hangar was. If you go to the LTA section, there's like this big building there, and then you see like a parking lot, and then there's a field next to it. Kind of that parking lot and that field is where the hangar was. And then they hadn't even put a mast in for Roma yet, and they just filled her with small balloons after that. Now, I do have the blueprints, like I said, over here. If you want to take a look at that. Out there, I have books, but I also have the dress cover from Sergeant Joseph Bryan's family, and I have the burial flag for Corporal or Master Sergeant Duke Flores. And I also have what I call the big binder. It was the classified investigation, if you want to flip through that. So thank you very much for having me.
Nancy, thank you again.
Thank you.